Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be discussing the final section of Chapter 19. Now, if you remember, yesterday we looked at the first part of this lesson, which was all about farming, but today I want to look at how the rise of farming in the West, and specifically on the Great Plains, impacted government. So specifically the formation of the Populist Party, and that is our essential question for today. Why was the Populist Party formed? And as you can see, I've already done an audio recording for this lesson, but I thought that a video recording might be helpful as well. Some of our key terms for today are inflation, Populist Party, and we will start and then end today talking about the Cross of Gold speech, which was an 1896 speech by a man named William Jennings Bryan, and it's very famous. It's one of the most famous political speeches in American history. So we will start out today looking at that. So before we begin, I want us to watch the following video, and the video is an excerpt of the speech made by Mr. William Jennings Bryan, whom we are going to talk about a little bit more. Now, a little background: Bryan was a populist, which we will also discuss in a few minutes, and he firmly believed that if the United States was going to grow and prosper, then it must be done on the backs of the working class, not by having an economy backed by gold. So he wanted to switch over from the gold standard to also allowing silver. So, and in this famous speech, he made the famous claim that you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. So I want you to take that statement and think about it. And think, what do you think he meant by crucifying mankind upon a cross of gold? And think about that statement as we go through today's lesson. So we'll start out with this video, and then we will pick up with the rest of the day's lesson.
I come to speak to you in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity. Mr. Carlyle said in 1878 that this was a struggle between the idle holders of idle capital and the struggling masses who produce the wealth and pay the taxes of the country. They tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country. We care not upon what line the battle is fought. If they say bimetallism is good, but that we cannot have it until other nations help us, we reply that instead of having a gold standard, because England has, we will restore bimetallism, and then let England have bimetallism because the United States has. If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
And we're back. The Populists and the election of 1896. Now, between 1891 and 1892, farmers and factory workers came together and helped form the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party. The Populist Party supported candidates who wanted to improve conditions for farmers and other workers. So they were the People's Party because they promoted things for the people, for farmers, for workers in Eastern industries. And they demanded the government raise farm prices as well as regulate railroad rates to better ensure that farmers in America could get a fair rate for their crops. The party supported the public ownership of the railroads, steamship lines, and telephone and telegraph systems. So it wanted public ownership of these different industries. And it also supported the free and unlimited coining of silver, the abolition of national banks, and a system of a graduated income tax, and the direct election of U.S. senators. Now, as we heard in the video, another major point that the Populist Party pushed for was the abolition of the gold standard, and that goes with the unlimited coinage of silver, or the coining of free silver that was mined in the West. And they believed that coining all of the silver that we could mine would improve the circulation of money. And actually, many populist ideas, such as the 8-hour workday and the direct election of U.S. senators and the abolition of national banks, eventually did become accepted in American life. So the party itself kind of fell out of favor eventually, but some of the things that they pushed for did actually make their way into American life and have become almost seemingly normal things within American life. So that was between 1891 1892 that the Populist Party was really being formed and coming into its own. Now, the Republican nominating convention met in St. Louis in 1896, and William McKinley, who's pictured right here, who at that time was the governor of Ohio, and also the driving force behind an earlier tariff known as the McKinley Tariff, McKinley had lined up more than enough votes to assure that he would be the nominee. But 34 of the delegates walked out of the convention and refused to accept the party's dedication to high protective tariffs and the gold standard. But despite the defection of these delegates, despite them walking out, the party really was seen as like their prospects were very positive. The country was actually going through a depression that had followed the Panic of 1893. It was expected that voters would blame the Democrats and then President Grover Cleveland. So the Republican nominating convention, William McKinley had basically all the votes lined up, but 34 of the delegates walked out because they had had enough of the dedication of the party to high protective tariffs and to the gold standard.
Grover Cleveland takes office for the second time in March of 1893. His inaugural address echoes themes that marked his first 4 years in office.
But then, just a couple of months after he took office, the economy basically came to a screeching halt. A depression started that lasted into the mid to late 1890s. Millions of people were out of work. Thousands upon thousands of businesses failed.
No group watches this scene unfolding with greater dismay than American farmers.
Many of them in the 80s, in a kind of boom time for agriculture, had purchased more land, had expanded westward, started new farms. In fact, to some degree, moving beyond the rainfall line and getting into situations where they couldn't even grow crops, let alone market them.
Industrialization and mechanization were transforming agriculture and making it so that what we now think of as agribusiness was possible and pursuable on a large scale. That meant a lot of small-time family farmers went out of business, and people went off the farms and looked for new jobs in cities where they would get jobs as unskilled laborers in factories or on docks and that sort of thing. If you did that, you'd be making about 25, 30 cents a day, and this led to tremendous labor unrest.
The plight of farmers fuels an agrarian revolt and the emergence of a new voice on the political scene, the Populist Party.
Which some historians have, I think, quite accurately described as being quite radical. So that's very scary, I think, for Americans in the 1890s, especially as the Populists are coming out of areas which ideologically are supposed to be the bedrock source of conservative sentiment in the country, the farmers.
And this led, of course, to an increasing support for economic measures to let up this pressure on the economy that the gold standard was pushing. So more and more support for populism and for silver in the early years of the 1890s.
In the summer of 1893, Cleveland calls Congress back into session to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act.
It was very difficult getting it through the Senate, and in fact, it was a knockdown, drag-out fight in his party, and eventually repeal did pass, but Cleveland managed to alienate a large portion of his party.
Most populists do not pay much attention to the silver issue at first, but as the party develops strength, the money question seems the way to win the support of more than farmers.
And this has American businessmen very upset and very unhappy, because it seems like there's going to be some kind of radical inflationary government elected if something isn't done.
So the Democrats convened in Chicago to select their candidate. However, the platform committee was split over whether to increase the nation's money supply. Now, the problem with just printing more money is that many believed it would lead to inflation. And inflation is an increase in prices, and if it goes unchecked, it could in turn wreck at that time the already fragile economy. So this temporary indecision and this time of just not really knowing what to do set the stage for our good buddy Mr. William Jennings Bryan, who at the time was a 36-year-old two-term congressman from Nebraska. And after a bunch of other candidates had made their speech, he got up and based his speech on this dilemma of whether or not to stay with the gold standard. And this speech electrified the convention and led to his nomination. Bryan's nomination really was not a surprise. He and his managers had been working for months to line up the necessary delegates, and so by having this great speech that electrified the whole audience, really was what was the culmination of all of that work, and it remains one of the most famous political speeches or political addresses in American history. Which brings us to the Populist Party. Now, in 1896, they reached a very critical juncture, they didn't really know which way they were going to go. Some wanted to support Bryan, but others worried that by merging with the Democrats, they would kind of lose their identity as populists and that the Populist Party would decline. Now, so in the end, the Populists nominated Bryan, but the party tried to assert its independence by giving the vice presidential nod to Thomas E. Watson of Georgia. So you have the Democrats nominating Bryan, as well as the Populists. So the Populists kind of teamed up with the Democrats for the election of 1896. So on one side you have Bryan, and on the other you have McKinley, and this is a picture of him sitting on his front porch at his home in Canton, Ohio. Why is he sitting on his front porch? Well, he conducted what he called a front porch campaign, in which he remained at home, and then he would actually bring supporters to his house on trains and other carriages to hear him deliver short speeches that were tailored for these audiences. And one of the main reasons for conducting his campaign like this was that his wife was seriously ill, and he was a very devoted husband. He was very deeply devoted to her. So while she was ill, he refused to go on long campaign trips that would keep him separate from his wife. So this front porch campaign, it did a couple of things. He was able to stay at home with his wife, but he was also able to bring supporters to him and tailor what he was going to say directly to those supporters. So supporters from New York, he would talk about issues in New York. If they brought supporters from Tennessee, he was able to talk about things going on in Tennessee, because people in Tennessee weren't necessarily going to care about what was going on in New York. So this campaign was both practical, but then it also served the purpose of him being able to stay at home with his wife. So, and I didn't mention this before, but it's important also to note that McKinley was not a very strong public speaker compared to Bryan. I mean, you heard part of Bryan's speech. McKinley, I mean, he could speak in public, but he was nowhere near to the level of Bryan. So McKinley's advisors thought that it would be wise to keep his large national speaking engagements, like really keep them to a minimum. So that's another reason why he had people come to his house. On the other hand, Bryan traveled throughout the country asking his audiences for their votes. And this paid off because in the early fall of 1896, many believed that Bryan was actually the front runner. And this was probably mostly due to the large crowds that would come out to see him speak and the excitement he created during the Democratic campaign. However, behind the scenes, the Republicans were very quietly managing to raise more than $2 million for the campaign compared to barely $300,000 for the Democrats. So Bryan was out giving these large speaking engagements and wowing these huge crowds, but the Republicans were raising the necessary funds to have a national campaign, but doing it much more quietly. In the end, it was not Bryan who was victorious. It was the new president, McKinley. And it was due a lot to their economic support. And due to that, the Republicans were able to produce a massive advertising campaign. So even though McKinley didn't travel around, they were able to advertise nationally, and their advertising campaign was huge. And also, I mentioned before that the country was kind of stuck in an economic depression following the Panic of 1893. So this failing economy really worked against the Democrats. Plus, there was Bryan's very flamboyant style, which was loved by farmers of the West and the South, but his speaking style actually alienated many immigrant voters who would normally have been Democratic supporters. So when the votes were counted, Bryan failed to carry any of the northern industrial states, and many argued that although he was a great speaker, Bryan's message was just too narrow and did not resonate. Like the voters in the cities and the heavily populated areas of the East just really weren't feeling what he was saying. His message was just a little too narrow for them. It didn't speak to them. And so this last video will talk more in depth about this Cross of Gold speech and about its impact on the Democratic Party, on the Populist Party, and ultimately on the election of 1896.
Cleveland is immensely unpopular by the time of that election. The Depression was very serious. So Republicans were in good shape for the 1896 election because they could say to the American people, you threw us out in 90 and 92 because you didn't like our activist approach to government, but look what the Democrats have given you. They've given you depression. Put us back in power. We'll get the economy back on track.
The Democratic Party was on the verge of falling apart in the 1890s. It was dramatically split by the populist movement. So by moving to the right to elect a president, the Democratic Party alienated a large part of its constituency who went into the Populist Party.
And so as you move toward the 1896 campaign, the nominating conventions, the Republicans chose William McKinley, and he was the living embodiment of the tariff issue. He believed many of the things that Harrison had believed, but what he had that Harrison did not have was a very gracious personality, very smooth sort of person, got along with people very, very well. It used to be said that Harrison could say yes to a man and he'd go away mad, and McKinley could say no to a man and he would go away pleased, because McKinley knew how to handle people in a way that Harrison never did.
The Democratic Convention of 1896 is the scene of unusual drama. Southern and Western delegates are determined to seize control of the party from conservative Easterners. They also want to incorporate into the party's platform some of the populist demands, including free silver. William Jennings Bryan is called upon to speak.
He's only 36 years old at the time, young, handsome Nebraska congressman, makes an eloquent plea for free silver, saying, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And he electrified the convention, and he had it in his mind that that's what he wanted to do, and the convention did, in fact, turn to him and nominated him for president.
The choice of Bryan and the inclusion of populist ideas in the platform places the populists in an awkward position. Do they name their own candidate and split the protest vote? Or do they embrace the Democratic candidate? In a controversial vote, the convention decides to support Bryan, and thus begins an interesting campaign.
William McKinley stayed home and campaigned almost literally from his front porch. Delegations would come to his house in Canton, Ohio, and McKinley's men would look over their speech first to make sure they didn't say anything embarrassing to the candidate. It was all very well orchestrated. Bryan did just the opposite. He did make a campaign tour of several weeks, thousands upon thousands of miles, sometimes carrying his own baggage on railroad trips, and pleading for his position, which was primarily the free silver position.
American businessmen, of course, band together to back the campaign of William McKinley in 1896, who is often depicted on campaign posters as standing on a large gold coin, because that's essentially the basis of his platform. We will not have inflation. We will not have silver. We will not have any other crazy populist scheme. We will stick with what is familiar and safe. And William McKinley is elected president in 1896.
In fact, McKinley got the largest majority of any candidate since General Grant's re-election in 1872. What you see with the election of 1894, the congressional elections, and then followed by the presidential election of 1896, is a major shift in the voting population in the United States. Historians and political scientists refer to these as realigning elections. What we had had for 2 decades previous to that, basically from the mid-70s to the mid-90s, was an equilibrium between the two major parties, and presidential elections could go either way. But what happens in the mid-90s, masses of voters leave the Democratic Party and shift to the Republican Party. And what's key is that they stay. The Republicans emerge as the majority party, and this is what both parties have been angling to become for 2 decades.
With the inauguration of William McKinley, there is a return to relative calm. McKinley and his allies concentrate on one issue, the raising of tariff rates.
The Republicans pass a protective tariff. They begin to do the things that they've been promising to do. And for reasons fairly unrelated to what they did, the economy improved.
Actually, what happens in 1897 is there's an increase in the world supply of gold, and that lets up a lot of the pressure that had been bearing down so heavily on farmers, laborers, and other debtors. And you do have the creation of jobs, you have the reopening of factories, you have the return of what McKinley campaigned on, which was the full lunch pail. So he's able to take credit, as presidents usually do, for a rising economy.
The Republican victory, however, does not end the battle over power and corruption in American life. It simply redirects it into other channels, as the United States begins to emerge as an imperialist nation.
Which brings us to the assignment. Now, there is not a written assignment for this lesson, but be sure to review the key terms, inflation, cross of gold speech, the populists, and as well as the points behind the founding of the Populist Party. What was it? It was also known as the People's Party, why it was founded, and you're going to also need to know the political differences between William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley for the upcoming Chapter 19 test. All right, and like always, if you have any questions, please come and find me. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.